Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, where my co-hosts David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's energy challenges, highlighting the Albertan and Canadian context. If this is your first time joining us, Energy versus Climate is a live webinar and podcast that drops every other week. Visit energyversusclimate.substack.com to register for updates and get exclusive access to join our live webinars, ask us questions, and engage with us directly. The focus of today's show is on hydrogen. Hydrogen is once again the number one element in the energy transition world. Will the new low-carbon hydrogen economy really deliver, or is it just a lot of hype recycled from the first hydrogen wave of 15 to 20 years ago? To help us unpack that, we're joined by special guest Dr. Francis O'Sullivan, Senior Lecturer at the MIT Sloan School of Management and the Head of Onshore Strategy for Danish energy company Ørsted. Over the course of the episode, we'll discuss three broad questions related to hydrogen: how to make it, where is it useful, and what should a Canadian hydrogen strategy be? Now on to the show. So, without any further ado, let's start by tackling that how to make hydrogen question with a short Hydrogen 101 with our very own Sarah Hastings-Simon.
Thanks, Ed. I guess I'm going to disappoint everybody that we're not going to go into the physics and the Bohr model of the hydrogen atom, but really just share...
You're disappointing me anyway.
Disappointing David. Yes, there you go. But what I am going to try to do briefly is just explain a few key points to keep in mind when we talk about hydrogen, right? And so the first one that's really important is to remember that hydrogen is an energy carrier, not a primary fuel source that can be produced. It can be produced from primary fuel sources like hydrocarbons, but there's no reservoir of, pure H2 sitting somewhere that we can draw from. And so when we talk about an energy carrier, that's something that can be used to store and move energy around, but that energy still has to come from somewhere. And so that's really important when we think about, hydrogen powering the economy. We're really talking about the idea of that energy carrier with the primary energy coming from somewhere else, be it the hydrocarbons or be it electricity that, for example, is generated from solar power or wind or others. So we'll revisit that a bit more. So as an energy carrier, hydrogen is interesting because it has a relatively high energy per mass. So there's a lot of energy and a little amount of weight of it in it. It's a relatively light, being number one on the periodic table, relatively light atom. But it also has, on the other hand, a relatively low energy per volume compared to a hydrocarbon. So it has less weight, but takes up more space than something like gasoline or diesel. And so there's obviously advantages on the weight side, especially if you're not space constrained, but it is more difficult to move around and to store. You have to compress it more, you have to put more energy into getting it from point A to point B than you would other hydrocarbons. So again, that will play into some of the discussions that we have around the role that we see for it later on. And then finally, just a note on the use of hydrogen, because fuel cells is a word that comes up very often when we hear talk about hydrogen. And so hydrogen, there's really two main ways to convert the energy that's stored in the energy carrier of hydrogen into useful work. And so you can either burn it, much like you think of burning natural gas, or you can use a fuel cell. And so these two things are very similar in the sense that you have, some kind of box and you put the fuel into it and out comes the work. The advantage compared, obviously with the traditional hydrocarbons that we talk about is that there's no CO2 produced as a byproduct when you burn it. And so at relatively large scale, so if we're talking about, a power plant, a large ship, that kind of thing, a traditional, combustion turbine is pretty efficient. You can actually do a pretty good job at that. Fuel cells are really beneficial when you want to make much smaller engines where you don't get the same level of efficiency from the turbines. And so if you want to be using hydrogen to power smaller things like personal vehicles or produce power or use electricity in small ways, that's where fuel cells become really important. So they're not critical for all uses of hydrogen, but they can be useful for some. And so these are all things that will come into play as we discuss a bit later on, where we think hydrogen has a real potential and how Canada should engage.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. That's helpful. I hope I found it helpful as a non-physicist. I hope you did as well. David, over to you to introduce Frank.
Terrific. I won't say much, except I've met Frank through his MIT role. He helped to lead, for example, MIT's big solar power study and been really dynamic in that role. But he's been back and forth to industry over his career, which is one of the things I really appreciate, because there's a lot of academics who study energy who don't have much clue about the real world. And right now, Frank's primary job is actually back to industry, working as this lead at Ørsted. And recently we collaborated on a paper on solar electrolytic hydrogen that we can talk about a little bit. But I really want to turn it over to you, Frank, to talk in general about how you see the new kind of hype around hydrogen, where you see the opportunities that are real as opposed to maybe not so much. And,
Right.
and especially as kind of long run trade-off between the battle between electrolytic hydrogen from wind or solar versus natural gas CCS hydrogen.
Yeah. Well, thanks, David, and thanks, Ed and Sarah, for having me. Always nice to be chatting with some folks from north of the border. So, hydrogen, this is a great time for this topic. Obviously, that's why you picked it, because it's certainly now coming to the fore, not just within the kind of, energy policy kind of think tank circles, but actually increasingly now, I think, within the kind of energy sector. People are beginning to kind of realize that a convergence is potentially beginning to emerge, or the potential for that convergence. And hydrogen is really the vehicle, the carrier that could do that. Most fundamentally, I think what's driving this, first and foremost, is the fact that if we look today, let's say, here in North America, at the kind of cost effectiveness of renewable energy, so wind and solar in some regions, and how that has evolved over, let's say, the last 5 years, we've kind of really transitioned from a place where those assets were on the margin, required a lot of support and so on, to a point where in many instances, not everywhere, but in many instances now, they really represent, in an unsubsidized fashion, the most cost-effective way of delivering electrons. And indeed, this is a problem for the sector, because in the restructured power market, so Alberta's power market, for example, certainly in the United States, where you have kind of electricity pricing on the margin, what you have is a situation where more and more of the hours are being met by very low cost or free electrons, effectively. And for the people that own those renewable assets that are driving that dynamic, there is kind of a cannibalization of their own cost effectiveness. And so people are beginning to say, okay, well, this is interesting. We've done, we've kind of worked ourselves to a position today where now we're able to produce very low cost electrons, but the market that we're feeding into is just kind of going to continue to kind of effectively erode. Where does this end? Let's try and begin to think about interesting adjacencies. And at last, and maybe coming back to your point at the outset, Ed, coming the full circle on hydrogen, people said, well, let's go back and have a look at hydrogen, because obviously it can provide a very interesting bridge between the power sector and a variety of other sectors. Let's take, for example, the petrochemical sector or the fertilizer sector, where hydrogen, which is the vast majority of kind of global hydrogen currently, hydrogen demand currently sits in those two sectors, and they're feeding that demand with hydrogen produced via steam methane reforming from natural gas and so on. Can we begin to think about our ability to use these very low cost electrons, coupling it with where electrolyzers are today, and maybe opening up an opportunity for quote unquote green hydrogen within the overall hydrogen economy? My point of view, and I've made, David and I have chatted in depth about this over the years, I think my point of view is that academically people are beginning to see, oh yeah, that's interesting. The next decade could be very interesting for hydrogen in this role. But commercially, I think the actual opportunity is even nearer term. Not everywhere, but there are certain parts of the world where there is a combination of circumstances that I think could open up a seam for truly, cost competitive green hydrogen. And that's all very exciting because, hydrogen is the kind of business that I think the energy sector would feel comfortable pivoting into pretty quickly. Certainly the renewable energy sector, it's kind of infrastructure investment, it's long-term contracting, it's very it's very complementary to the overall business model. And, you know, just as evidence of this, you're beginning to see announcement, pilot projects, but I would say, you know, behind those pilot projects, there's a lot of work ongoing out looking at more tangible projects. A lot of the excitement is in Europe, for sure. I think in Europe, there's a slightly different dynamic going on there. There's a kind of coherence regarding the regulation. The Commission wants to make things work. A lot of people are working hard to do that. Here in North America, I think things are a little bit different. I personally think it's going to be a more market-driven solution. And personally, I think it's actually going to be a nearer term big opportunity here than potentially in Europe, because I think we are, you know, actually physically advantaged with our natural resources and so on. So there's a little context. I'm pretty excited about it, and I'm a pretty cynical guy when it comes to kind of big energy transitions and so on. But I see an alignment now between capital, technology, where it's at, and I suppose then ultimately kind of practical downstream demand and an appetite for the big consumers beginning to say, there's something happening here, we should look into it.
I wonder a lot about the way the competition will play out between technologies that have a real producer learning curve in small units that you can fund in small units and things that are big and scalable. I mean, 15 years ago, I worked a lot on CCS, and there's no question that if you had to produce a giant quantity of carbon neutral hydrogen today, you know, the Alberta advocates are right. Natural gas plus CCS would crush some kind of electrolytic option right now, no question.
Yeah.
But I think the question is how that plays out, because that's only true when you build big projects. They're hard to build. They take a long time to site, and the technology evolves slowly. Whereas if you're talking wind or solar plus commodity electrolysis, those are things where you can put together a project that's kind of a couple 100 megawatt scale. You can get the project done fast. There's a fast learning curve, and all those manufacturers are competing on this learning curve. And my guess is that electrolytic definitely wins in the end. But I think the big question is the end kind of a decade away or 2 decades away? Because that really matters for this kind of emerging Alberta excitement around how we've got this great hydrogen resource. If by the time there's really a market, we're outcompeted by electrolytic, then it's not very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's, I personally, that message really resonates with me. I think around the world today, there are many solutions. So take CCS, right? We've been talking about it for a long time. It's not like, how can we do this? I mean, it's doable, but it's really a reflection of a scaling issue. So it needs to be at a certain scale that I think is kind of, you know, not really at that human scale, if you wish. It just, and most importantly, I think it's enormously limiting for the balance sheet, you know, in terms of people with the balance sheet that can actually do this. So, you know, only the largest corporations, only sovereign nations really can kind of go for first of a kind mega scale projects like that. Probably very reflective of, like, you know, what it took to get the LNG business up and running, you know, whatever, 50 years ago. It was literally 2 countries coming together, shaking hands and saying, we are going to be in a close relationship for the next 25 years, just to make that contract happen. By contrast, like the way I think about it on the electrolyzer side, David, is really analog to maybe my other technologies, my wind and solar. So actually, the electrolyzer in many respects is a simpler technology than a wind turbine. Exactly. Wind turbines, you know, we talk about wind turbines being pretty commoditized, but actually pretty complicated machine. There's something up there spinning, right, for 10, 15, 20 years, 30 years actually. You kind of really want to have a German gearbox or whatever it happens to be, right? There's a degree of kind of complexity to that. The other end is, and one, by the way, it's 3 megawatts or 4 or 5 or 8 if you're offshore.
11 last week. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. By contrast, you know, 400 watt solar panel, I know I need 1.5 million of them, but you know, it's much more commoditized. It's much more scalable. I need 1.5 million of them for my 600 megawatt solar farm in South Texas, but I need 5 of them for my roof, you know, to kind of be 2 kilowatt. And personally, I think that the electrolyzer as a technology paradigm is kind of at scale going to be able to kind of take advantage of the fact that a happy place for an electrolyzer is in a kind of, let's say, single megawatt scale is a very nice sized unit. It's highly modular in that context. You know, it fits perfectly into a variety of footprints at, let's say, contemporary, at scale wind or solar facilities. And basically, I think, it's going to be a little bit like battery storage at some of these solar facilities. It's just like, obviously, you build an electrolyzer.
I think
with one caveat. The one caveat is that for the hydrogen story, you got to get the stuff somewhere that somebody can use, right? That would be the one caveat, right?
I think what's so interesting is I get a sense that the electrolyzer world is really moving fast. So, as I mentioned, Frank and I just published an academic paper that looked at this, and we had academic reviewers pissing on us because they said we were too optimistic about electrolyzer costs because we can't cite the right academic literature on electrolyzer costs. But I think Frank has seen through his own business, and I've seen indirectly through some other big project developers, that people are actually getting real quotes from big companies now that are stunningly low, quotes that are well under $500 a kW. This interesting trade-off between the PEM and the alkaline, they're both playing. And that really is a dynamic thing that was unexpected.
Okay. So I'd like to, because I'd like to move us ahead and, because the skeptics, frankly, they look at the new hydrogen economy in the way they looked at nuclear fusion, which is no matter where you are in history, it's always 5 to 10 years away, or frankly, carbon capture, which by most accounts, and I'm hoping it's changed, but if you look at it objectively, you'd say so far it's been a failure to launch. So I want to do that by looking at hydrogen less in terms of carbon intensity or colors and more in terms of applications, and get all three of you to weigh in on these applications. Just before I go there, I want to point out we've got our poll results in because we asked, by 2030, will low carbon hydrogen production be mostly electrolytic, otherwise known as green hydrogen, or derived from fossil fuels and CCS, otherwise known as blue? You have voted, 38% said mostly from electrolytic, 44% from fossil fuels and CCS. And the third option, it doesn't matter, low carbon hydrogen production will still be marginal at 18%. So just want to let you know about those poll results. So let's talk about the applications. Hydrogen's dynamism gives you lots of options around use. Cross-transportation, heating, processing, potentially even energy storage for power. So I want to do this, all three of you, in rapid response popcorn style, meaning anyone is free to jump into comments and offer opinions. So let's start with one of those uses. Let's start with transportation. And what we, I think, agree on, we agree that Elon Musk and electrons, they've won the personal and the light-duty mobility war over Ballard fuel cells and molecules, and that hydrogen fuel cell cars will never rival EVs or Teslas. I think we all agree on that. I think we're good. But what are the mobility applications for hydrogen? Like if you're a major retailer like Walmart or Amazon and you have a fleet of, say, heavy-duty trucks to distribute your products, does it make sense economically or logistically to use, say, hydrogen fuel cell trucks, or will EVs win that battle as well? So over to the three of you.
So I'll jump on the trucks. So I mean, there's some sorts of transports that I still see a lot of potential. So like the heavy haul trucks in mining. Maybe we'll talk a little about airplane and ships. I'm still pretty skeptical about even the big Class 8 trucks, and a couple of reasons for that. So battery technology is still advancing quite rapidly, and so this is really a race basically between batteries and hydrogen. And when you talk about batteries right now for the Class 8, those are those big trucks like the red one up there on my picture behind me. Those trucks, only a portion of those are actually doing long distance hauling. So a lot of those trucks are doing shorter distances that are really can be managed with the batteries that we have today. And so I see it more likely playing out that, you get the short distance trucks electrified, and then the batteries come down and they end up winning out in that space. Not necessarily because, if you put them head to head, hydrogen couldn't be a better option, but I just think the batteries are too far ahead in that race.
Okay. What about, sir, someone else want to jump in?
Sure. I'll offer. Just to be clear, I think Elon in quotes, I think it's clear that electrification will win for short range light duty vehicles in the long run. It's still further than people think, but it will. But I think this really interesting thing is where hydrogen has an inherent advantage in transport. And obviously the biggest place is where the weight, the energy per unit mass really matters, and that's aircraft. And people know this for a long time. First of all, you don't need much new engine technology. Combustion turbines on existing aircraft have efficiencies near 50%. And there's no reason they can't burn hydrogen. That's it's easy for me to say, I'm not the aircraft turbine engineer, but it's a relatively straightforward thing to do. The big issue is really how you build the hydrogen storage. For aircraft, you almost certainly do liquefied hydrogen, which means you don't need a pressure tank, but you're doing it between places that are point-to-point big infrastructure. You're not flying to random places. That's the key. You've got a limited number of places in a network. And so I think it's not ridiculous to do. The challenge is the extraordinary capital cost and risk of building a new aircraft. I mean, each of these big new aircraft families that are even tiny changes, like, 787 or the Neo on the Airbus side, those are like make or break the company. And, those are small innovations. A hydrogen-powered aircraft is a doubly break the company. So I think it would need a level of state intervention to have a chance of happening.
I mean, that would resonate with me entirely. I think you draw out something really interesting in that example, David. So, okay, take your aircraft, right? You own a fleet of aircraft. You want flexibility in what you're doing with that aircraft. So you could imagine two airports that have hydrogen infrastructure. I would personally, like, the way I would run this is you would have your electrolyzer, your hydrogen farm at the airport, right? You just pump in the power on the overhead lines. You're producing the hydrogen there. The infrastructure isn't actually all that difficult to put in place, but you have to put it in place everywhere for somebody to want to buy that aircraft.
That's right.
Because that's how people use aircraft. The same issue actually for me with heavy duty trucks. So if you think about heavy duty trucks, actually one of the big businesses, or it's interesting to kind of think about the business of heavy duty trucks, they're all owned by fleet owners who don't actually own, oftentimes lease owners who don't even own that, like, that's not their business. They're relying on residual value. They're going to move those trucks to Mexico. They're going to move those trucks to South America for the resid value post their US or Canadian existence. Oh, and by the way, if you don't have the infrastructure there, you're not going to do that. So there's like real barriers, I think, in kind of doing this for transport that I think are kind of maybe not overwhelming, but real
huge. But I think the interesting thing is the different case for aircraft, whereas for trucks and most other things, all this stuff from the point of view of the operator, it's like those damn environmentalists, they're just costing me money. It's going to be hard. There's no upside. But for aircraft, there is an upside. When an aircraft takes off, it's like 40% fuel by weight. That just shapes everything about aircraft design. If you actually could get to a hydrogen-powered aircraft, you as the aircraft operator have an aircraft that does a lot more. It's really worth more money to you.
Yeah, one idea locally, and by locally, Frank, it's here in Alberta, is to anchor and start a hydrogen economy in Alberta's industrial heartland. So think northeast of Edmonton, because recent analysis shown, and there's a think tank called the Transition Accelerator that's looked at this, that it's one of the lowest cost places in the world to make hydrogen from steam methane reform with CCS, so not electrolytic. And so there's a scheme looking at can you get it down from the industrial heartland to places in Calgary where then you can use it to displace diesel in trains, diesel in trucks, and potentially for use at, say, the Calgary airport. But you're talking about using an electrolyzer, making it on-site in an airport. Have you looked at the all-in economics when right now just the cost of production side is about half for blue hydrogen is what it is green hydrogen through the modeling. But all in, if you're the Calgary Airport Authority, which would you be betting on?
Well, let me give you a very tangible example of this. Now, this is another south of the border example, so my apologies. But in the US, the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Agency, they make the rules on how the grids work cross state, not in Texas, but other than that. And they, to support battery deployments on the grid, they issued a rule that basically meant that if you were let's say a wind or any power plant for that matter, actually pumping power onto the grid, but that power was going to feed a battery somewhere else that you owned, and it was kind of a coordinated effort, that transmission of power did not incur the transmission tariff. So basically, we're not going to charge you for using the grid like that, okay? That's a huge advantage. Now, hydrogen's problem is, as we discussed, moving the stuff, right? Yeah. Much easier to move the electrons. We have the infrastructure to move the electrons. FERC could literally rewrite a rule that said, I can park my wind farm out in West Texas where that thing is running flat out, producing almost zero value electricity on a pretty regular basis. And I can literally just put in a wire that exists, run it straight across the state of Texas, into the Houston Ship Canal, park it on a electrolyzer located within a petrochemical complex, and I am delivering my very cost-effective hydrogen, and I have suddenly bypassed the problem of infrastructure. So I think that's a very significant potential advantage in certain circumstances for the electrolytic. And this comes back to the point about it also being pretty modular. You can put your electrolytic systems in different places. And I would say, just going back to the poll, I tend to agree with this poll. I'm not suggesting it has to be electrolytic. The question is, I think that the challenge for blue hydrogen is getting that first project up and running, because I think if you can get to that scale, I think there's a place for both pathways. And Alberta, by the way, might well find that given your resources, blue is a better resource. But, blue is going to be challenging in Texas, for example, just with population density, carbon sequestration challenges, etc.
And the first plant challenge, Frank, as well. No one wants to fund the first plant. Sorry, I'm doing a poor job of managing a rapid response conversation in the applications. I want to get us to heating. So what about space heating? Should we be blending hydrogen into natural gas pipeline networks, or should we try to change out natural gas with hydrogen entirely to achieve net zero building heating? So who wants to jump in?
Well, I'll make a quick comment.
Okay.
Certainly, I'm familiar with very significant players in that business who are desperately trying to figure out how they can go about at least introducing blends of hydrogen. And I do think, it might well be an interesting transitional path in some markets. Thing about it is obviously like the idea of just pure electrification of space heating works in many places. So this is one of those things. I don't think it's one or the other. I think you could have a blend of solutions, and then it becomes a little bit unclear whether you can make one work versus the other.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think the way that you do that in practice is you blend the bit in, whether that's, somewhere around the range of 10 to 20%, I think is what people mostly talk about, where you can do that without significant CapEx investments. So, you don't want to be putting a ton of money into something that is going to be a transition, but where it can be a transition and where it can help to sort of support the start of that hydrogen industry and where it can reduce some of your emissions in the meantime, using infrastructure that you already have, I think it's a great thing to do, but it's one of these, do it carefully.
Okay. So what about hydrogen as an industrial feedstock? So, electrification of heavy industries is not feasible in the short term. Perhaps we'll agree on that as well, like for cement and steel making or chemicals. Can we instead use low carbon hydrogen as a means of industrial decarbonization?
I'm excited about this one, so I'll jump in and say yes, we can. And I think I see that as almost the biggest opportunity for hydrogen. And what I also see in it is actually the potential for hydrogen to kind of reshape the footprint of those industries in some cases, right? So when you talk about the industrial heartland in Alberta, or Frank's example of the Houston, and you look at the history of some of these industries like steel and other, where they exist is because that's where there was access to the materials that was needed to make those. And so, on the one hand, it's hard to move big industries. So I'm not suggesting that, everything will be rewritten from scratch, but I do think that there will be a bit of a shifting around of, where some of these industries are taking place. And actually, also importantly, where the value is in the value chain. If you think about, going all the way from the energy extraction to the production of, your widget that you've made out of the steel, I think we're sometimes a little bit too focused on, how is hydrogen going to replace the coal, as opposed to saying, well, if we have a very major shift in the way that we're producing the end product, how will actually, constraints or scarcity shift where that value sits?
Great. Okay. Jump in.
At one point on that, this is a no-brainer from my point of view. The world consumes today 2% of our primary energy consumption, ballpark, is just to make hydrogen. Right? This is the point. I'm like, the hydrogen story, let's say in the electrolytic hydrogen story, it's not like, we need to carve out, can we get some, fuel cell vehicles to make this work? I'm like, forget it. I'm going straight after the, literally, 100 odd facilities that are consuming.
So the audience knows, there's basically two uses, ammonia and hydrogen going to petroleum for hydrocracking and upgrading. And those are, yeah, as you said, like close to 2% primary.
Ballpark, like 60-40.
It's huge.
Petrochemicals and fertilizer. And I'm like, this is today, right? This is not like, oh, we need to create a new business. It's like, can we create a product that's cost effective or vaguely cost effective today? And I think that's pretty close. But I think to Sarah's point, the advantage is obviously that these facilities, there's going to be, they're in that kind of long-term investment cycle. So if you're, for example, having to build new capacity for steam methane reforming, you're going to think really hard about how does this make sense, this new facility versus some alternative facility? Because it's going to have to be able to be there for the next 20, 30 years to pay for itself. And I think we're kind of arriving at that point now where investors are are stepping back and saying, it's not that obvious. I'm going to think carefully about this. And I think once you've arrived at that point, you're kind of at that turning, you're at that junction. So I'm all about focusing on today's markets. I'm actually less bothered about, for example, aviation and so on at the moment. I think the next 5-10 years are about transforming, industrial hydrogen demand, which is a meaningful kind of energy consumer and source of CO2 broadly anyway.
Yep. So that's thanks, Frank. That's a great segue to the last topic I want us to touch upon until we open up to questions, and that's the right hydrogen strategy for Canada. So this is timely because the federal government here is putting the final touches on a federal hydrogen strategy, a national hydrogen strategy that they'll unveil sometime this fall. In fact, the speech from the throne is happening right now, taking away market share from us.
I can hear the Queen.
You can hear the Queen's representative. Thought I heard a mention of hydrogen, could get a mention in the throne speech. We've got strengths in Canada. We've got good feedstock and cheap power, cheap gas. We've got an energy sector with technical know-how, and they're looking for lateral moves. We got a bunch of companies, over 100 established in hydrogen and fuel cell technology, and we got export channels as well. So what should Canada's hydrogen strategy be? David, jump in.
Yeah, I'd like to. So this several efforts, including this thing called the Transition Accelerator, led by a real friend of mine, David Lozelle, have, I think, done a great job thinking about it. But I got to say, I really don't agree with their answer, because their answer is really, I think, focused on kind of replicating the old Alberta model, which is we dig something out of the ground and we send it south. It's just now we're going to dig something out of the ground and turn it into hydrogen and send it south. It's built around the idea that the core value proposition for Canada for hydrogen is actually large-scale production and export of hydrogen. And from my point of view, that seems really unlikely. Partly the inherent difficulty of moving hydrogen long distances means that if you imagine you're competing with wind or solar hydrogen to supply large amounts of hydrogen, say to the US or some other market, there is a short window where CCF natural gas hydrogen will win, but it's short, I think. My view is that the thing to really focus on, if Canada was going to do anything, is to focus on a few use cases and focus on really subsidizing them, pushing them hard to an industrial cluster with the hope that the technology gets exported, not the hydrogen itself. So maybe we figure out a really good way to make the whole infrastructure around hydrogen long distance trucking or aircraft, and move on aircraft business here or whatever, some part of it, and then that gets done. So I think the big question for me is, are we focusing on developing technologies that we export, or actually mass production of hydrogen that we export as an energy carrier? And I think that latter is really unlikely to win.
Well, David, I'll just say, because our poll is up, and should Canada focus on a few hydrogen end-use technologies or focus on production? The second option is production, including for export. As you were speaking, you checked the progress of the option. It looked to be the runaway leader until you weighed in.
I mean, there's been a bunch of, Joule Bergerson and some others did some stuff on this, the inherent competition. Like, remember, if you want to make hydrogen somewhere else, you can move the natural gas and then they can do the conversion there. Or you can move electricity and they can move it there. And it turns out that moving hydrogen is just mostly a crappy thing to do because it's a low heating value, hard to compress gas.
Yeah.
You could move fertilizer though, David.
Yes.
Pretty easily. I mean, I think.
Yes, and we do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I would subscribe to that, though. Interestingly enough, I mean, I'm a little bit less bullish on the technology. My personal view on the kind of the electrolyzer, let's say, at the core, is that it's done. It's a solved problem. I don't care about another 5% of efficiency or whatever. all I care about now is, are you going to give me that 5% discount on my CapEx? Because and genuinely, like, that'll move the needle faster, right? It's a very interesting, like, right now, in the kind of contemporary discussion about hydrogen, like, it was all about PEM electrolyzers for a while. Now I'm like, maybe actually alkaline electrolyzers just fine. We're going to, like, we'll figure it out, right? So, and then, like, you know, and we've seen this with the solar story, right? It's this is where it leans towards solar. But what I'm interested in, or where I think Canada has a really interesting opportunity, is like just putting together the overall framework to allow the broad industry to succeed. So, for example, Canada has tremendous kind of expertise and depth in investment in infrastructure. This is all about infrastructure investment, getting comfortable, building the expertise to deploy these technologies, thinking about the business model, right? Do we own the value chain now, from the wind farm right the way through to my fertilizer manufacturing facility, for example? And how do you put those kind of businesses together? And I would also argue that I also think there's a kind of an all of the above type solution at play here. Again, something that you guys are reasonably well positioned. But to do. But the idea of just simply focusing on the dig it out of the ground and we'll pump it south kind of story, I don't think it's going to win. I think you need something a little bit more modular in your thinking.
So briefly, so I agree with you guys on that. I think the other thing that I see happening often in the discussion is this idea that, like, well, if hydrogen is going to replace the oil, then, you know, the value that's in the oil will shift to the value that's in the hydrogen, and that market will work in the same way. And obviously that's, you know, completely not true. And there's all kinds of good reasons that countries that may even, you know, be willing to pay somewhat of a premium to build up a set of electrolyzers to give them the fuel security that they, you know, so desperately would want to have. So I think that's being lost in the conversation. I do think, though, going back to the point around the transition accelerator and this idea of, you know, which should it be, I think we do need to sort of do something to get going. And so, you know, if the trucking and the is the first way to make that happen, you know, even if we're not going to be exporting the hydrogen, ultimately, we're not going to be able to get ahead or make progress on developing the end use technologies without having the hydrogen. And so I do think that there is a real value in that approach that's being taken. I think the thing that I would want to add on to it and you know, see more of is more of this consideration of the ultimate business model and where does that value sit within the value chain. I think we're only, you know, just starting to have that conversation, but I don't think it's a wrong move to say, well, you know, clearly we need to start getting going on this. And I think that's what they've done. So.
Okay. I want to move us to questions, but first the poll results. David, you couldn't quite stop the momentum of production, including for export. It won it by a nose. So a few hydrogen end-use technologies, 41%, production, including for export, 43%, production, but not for export, too many barriers, 16%. Okay, thanks everyone for taking the time to vote. Let's go to our first audience question. So this is from Jan McQuay, and this gets to our applications question. Why not just use hydrogen as a storage tank that can produce electricity when it's needed? That way, when wind turbines are running at night, when the electricity isn't needed, it can make hydrogen, and that can be supplied to the grid in the daytime. And this is some of the buzz around hydrogen, and particularly in carbon-intensive grids like Alberta, it can help with decarbonization of the grid. So over to the three of you.
Well, I'll jump in right off the bat. So
go ahead, Frank.
One of the headaches for hydrogen within the context of this discussion for storage is that, all the way back to Sarah's point, hydrogen is not a primary energy source. You first have to make it, and then you have to convert it again. So you lose, you got a double kind of efficiency hit. And so the headroom, or the competitive gap for using hydrogen, for example, as energy storage in the short run is pretty significant. However, you know, people genuinely do look at hydrogen as potentially a kind of seasonal storage option. So if you have very low cost storage, there's a very interesting example actually in Utah. There's a LA DWP have a very large coal facility there, and they're talking about converting it into a hydrogen facility. In fact, they've ordered a hydrogen capable natural gas turbine. And quite nearby, there's an enormous salt cavern. And the idea here is that they might be able to use that, much like natural gas storage, for seasonal storage. We'll have to see. But I think in the kind of short run, hydrogen is kind of not going to be able to be batteries for the kind of intraday or intraday kind of balance, for example. But over the seasonal extent, it might make sense in certain circumstances.
Yeah, and I look at this question too, and it sort of actually brings me to a broader point around when we talk about energy transitions and these sort of long-term questions, right? Because this type of seasonal storage, yes, this is a problem that we're going to need to solve. It probably makes a lot of sense to use our existing natural gas infrastructure and gas power plants to solve it in the near to midterm, right? So not to go all the way down to 100% renewables in the meantime. And I think to some extent, it's sort of, we should also be honest that we don't quite know, which is going to win out in the long run, right? I see it as a competition between transmission lines, other forms of chemical battery storage, maybe some of the heat storage stuff. And that's okay, right? Like, I think it's sort of, we set out a pathway, but I think we should also, and I'm sort of saying we, the energy modeling and transitions community, should also be honest about the idea that, some of these things we don't know. We know that something will work, but we just need to set the policies that direct us on a pathway to get there and not try to predict what it will be when we get there in the end.
Okay, great. I want to get to two water-related questions. The first one is talking about water with regards to steam methane reform. It's an anonymous question. From my literature review, it looks like steam reforming requires 18 to 20 liters of water per kilogram of hydrogen, while electrolytic production requires 11 liters of water per kilogram of hydrogen. In an increasingly water-stressed geography like Alberta, should this be something that is more discussed?
I think no. When you do the math, the water that's part of the energy system is just tiny compared to uses for agriculture and other uses. To give you a sense of costing, water costs, even in water-stressed places, even water from desalination is of order $1 a cubic meter, so $1 a ton, and the hydrogen that you're going to sell has costs of order $2 or so a kilogram, so $2,000 a ton. Now there's an 8-to-1 weight difference or so, but it no version of water cost in any plausible place, except for the middle of the desert, will the water cost really be a big contributor to OPEX.
Yeah, just to think about it, like a one tanker, like a standard truck of water, probably 25 tons of water more. So $25 worth of water, that's going to produce 4 tons of hydrogen.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a lot, actually. That would be a very large hydrogen facility today.
Yeah.
Electrolytic hydrogen facility. So I don't think water is going to be one of the blockers here.
Gotcha. Okay. Another water-related question is just what quality of water is required for electrolyzers? Is that seawater, brackish water, fresh water?
It's sort of the same question, because again, what the electrolyzer actually wants is very clean water.
Yeah.
But the cost to do the pre-cleanup, which is typically part of the CapEx, the system you buy, is in general going to be very small. For the same reason I said that the modern cost at scale of large-scale seawater electrolysis, that is turning seawater into clean water, it's the wrong word.
Potable, yeah, desal.
Desal, that cost is now down to about $1 a cubic meter, $1 a ton. So in a sense, it doesn't matter that much what you start with.
Gotcha. Okay. Another question, moving right along here. Why do you think, this is getting back to mobility, why do you think that California is promoting the infrastructure for both hydrogen and battery cars? So we see some of this in Germany as well. Last time I checked, there were 200 some odd hydrogen filling stations in Germany. So what have they got right? Japan is making some bets as well. What has Toyota got right? So we've all basically dumped on hydrogen for personal mobility. Why is California hedging its bets through both electricity infrastructure and hydrogen infrastructure?
So I see 2 reasons for that. So one goes back to kind of the discussion we were having earlier around, what Alberta should do. And the idea that, getting started and having some local use cases for your hydrogen can be an important policy. When I think about the technology policies, one of them is a demand side policy. So make sure that you have something that, it wants to use the stuff that you're going to produce. So there's certainly a case on that side. I think the other, and this is really, in my mind, an example of, good kind of industrial policy, is that, we have a view about what's going to win out in the long run. It's rapidly evolving. If you had asked a group of experts, a little while ago, as we were earlier in the development of batteries and less mature, basically, people would be less sure. And so in general, when we're talking about developing these new technology pathways, we don't want to pick one, option too early on. You actually want to have different options that are sort of competing and having the runway to, see which works better. And the classic one that I return to is the idea of, solar PV versus concentrated solar panels or power, so like the big mirrors. If you go back 10, 15 years, people were having, legitimate discussions about maybe one will win out, maybe the other. We've clearly solar PV, has taken by far the lead in that. But there was a time when that was much less clear. And so it's important when we're looking at these policies to really be making sure that we're not counting anybody out too soon. And that also that when we look backwards at, decisions that were made and we say, oh, well, clearly this was a failure because we spent all this money on solar CSP, if you don't have some losers, I guess, in your technology bets, then you're not really making technology bets, is how I would put it.
Hear, hear. Well said.
Got you. Okay, here's another one. Annie Berube, I'm going to speak to your question. Could you please comment on the concept of blending hydrogen with natural gas, especially for export markets? So not just to dilute the natural gas I get to use my power in my furnace. Any economic sector where this makes sense from a GHG reduction perspective? Thanks for the question, Annie.
I think there might be, I think it makes sense where you have a really cheap source of carbon neutral hydrogen for some reason, and you don't have anything to do with it locally. So just blend it into the natural gas stream. And what's really interesting, I can't stop being a teacher. Why is natural gas called natural gas? Because it replaced town gas, which was artificial gas made from coal gasification, which flowed through pipeline networks in towns to power things before we found natural gas. And that gas actually had a lot of hydrogen in it. So it's actually not a new idea in a sense. It's going back 100 years. And it definitely could be done. But I don't see it as being large scale because fundamentally, the cost-effective way to decarbonize most of the building sector where that gas is going to be electrification, not going to hydrogen and then out. So I think there's going to be some niche use cases. People have talked about in Iceland for years, but I don't see it being a big case. Because if you're an industrial user and you really want to switch over as a cement plant or a steel plant, you want pure hydrogen.
Yeah. I wonder if there's like some angle. So for example, assuming Canada is an exporter of gas to the States, if there was this is a big if, there was a price of carbon on gas or on price of carbon in the US, whether there'd be some circumstance.
Biden will love fest, it's going to happen.
Yeah, that's true.
Great. Okay. We've got a live questioner, my old colleague, Don D'Souza. So Don, can you join us and ask your question live, please?
Sure. Hi, Ed, and thanks everyone for the great discussion so far. I had a question related to potential co-benefits for the different hydrogen pathways that you mentioned, and particularly whether anybody would want to speak about potential co-benefits for blue hydrogen production and potentially driving down the cost of CCS.
Well, I'll have a go at it. So yeah, if you really did a whole lot of blue hydrogen, then you'd be developing more CCS infrastructure. On the other hand, if CCS is really just simply the downhole injection part, my sense is this is building on downhole injection technology we've had, over kind of a century timescale, gradually evolving, and there's not a lot more to happen probably. For Alberta, I actually have a bit of the opposite concern. So my view, obviously not shared by everybody, is that Alberta really wants to decrease the total share of our economy and workforce bound up on oil and gas, because in the end, we're going to lose on that bet and we need to do something else. And I'm worried about blue hydrogen too much locking us in to even more continued investments in the oil and gas infrastructure that won't stop.
Yeah, and that, David, so that is a concern that's shared amongst, let's say, several environmental NGOs in the country, that it is going to promote lock-in. But to push back on that, if you've got this cheap blue hydrogen resource sitting there in the industrial heartland, and it's, as Don's suggesting, it's a catalyst for carbon capture, and in spite of what, Frank, maybe an optimal location still working, but let's say in Alberta, we've got a cheaper blue hydrogen resource than we do a green hydrogen resource. Should we be not making that investment right now?
Yeah, but it's not right to think of it as a resource. What we have is some huge hydrogen plants in the industrial heartland that are, tied in a very direct way to upgraders and to refineries. That's what it's used for. that's a kind of one-to-one tie. It's not like a resource sitting there. We could build more of them with CCS, but the question is, would we do that investment instead of some other?
Gotcha.
I guess, and that to me, that's the important piece is like, what are you going to end up using that for? And that lock-in comes, for example, in the case of, CCS with EOR, you risk the lock-in there of, well, if you're using it to produce more oil. I think the challenge that I have with CCS previously, was it's tied to coal. On the flip side, of course, it's becoming more and more clear we need some versions of it for whatever net zero pathway we're going to have or likely. But I think the key is, can you demonstrate a credible use for it within Alberta and within the construct that you're making that doesn't lock you in, right? And that's, I think, the challenge to people that are putting forward the idea of CCS as the growth pathway is, if it is that technology piece, then I think I buy it more because it is moving beyond.
Yeah. And Frank, so how much is this lock-in debate playing down in the US? And is the chief problem with blue hydrogen it's because it's got blue in the title and that makes us feel cold and sad?
No, I don't think so. I think that there are, look, it's very interesting. If you look at the kind of the global, let's say the global big oil players, like there was an article, maybe it was in the Journal or in Bloomberg earlier this week about like the divergent path between, let's say, the Euro majors and the US majors, and the Euro majors saying, look, and I think this is speculative or at least ambitious, like BP saying we're going to have 50 gigs of renewables by 2030 and we're going to be in all of these markets. But I think similarly, the idea of Exxon and Chevron saying we're going to stick with the kind of this fossil focused effort, and we think this is going to. I don't particularly think that's all that viable. I think in the States, I think the action is ultimately going to play out in Texas. I think Texas is really an interesting incubator. They're a tremendously ecumenical bunch when it comes to solutions. As long as it's Texas, they're happy. And so I think that we're going to see over the next few years some really interesting kind of back and forth between like the renewable sector that's kind of really pushing ahead there and the kind of the fossil sector, and then seeing each other as potential partners actually in this and kind of moving in that direction rather than, there being any kind of clear dividing line between one path and another path.
Yeah, great. And you're right. When you've got, unfortunately, some of the oil and gas majors who rightly or wrongly score very low on the trustworthiness surveys that are done there, and they're asking you to take a low carbon bet on two technologies, arguably both of which have been failures to launch, hydrogen and CCS, then unfortunately you get a lot of skepticism out there. Okay, we've got an interesting question here. We'll go back to California, and this might take us to the end, and then we'll wrap up. So this is from Greg Rao. Thank you, Greg. Ultra green negative emissions electrolytic hydrogen is now possible, but needs subsidies to compete with green and gray hydrogen, but 5 times the carbon credits relative to green hydrogen. So he's differentiating between green hydrogen and ultra green negative emissions electrolytic hydrogen. Does that mean we could have negative production costs under California's LCFS? And perhaps thinking if it's negative emissions, I know California LCFS will pay $200 a ton for direct air capture projects, no matter where they are located in the world, as long as you can prove that CO2 stays down whole. So who wants to?
I guess, Greg, I can guess a bit where this is going because it's connected with this clever stuff you've been doing. So my understanding of the LCFS regime, which is complicated, is that basically anything that ends up as transportation sector fuel in principle counts under the LCFS mandate. And then your upstream life cycle emissions are what's matter. So if you're making hydrogen through a process like the one I know you've worked on, where you're making hydrogen in a way that produces some negative emissions benefit, that counts. Just the way, ideas that say Jamie Rhodes and others have worked on of doing biofuel things that involve some BECCS into the California fuel stream count. And that was the thing that helped to make carbon engineering get going.
So I'm very familiar with that regime in California. I think that you're kind of if you're in the hydrogen business today and you're kind of looking at a value chain opportunity, LCFS today makes it a no-brainer actually to be building this infrastructure in California as it happens for hydrogen specifically. One of the challenges actually as it happens is finding adequate offtake that's willing to kind of pay you, because people are like very suspicious about like, do I want to lock into a 10-year bet on an LCFS contract here, for example? Yep. It's at $200 now. But, you know, if things are successful, it'll be $20 before we know it. And I think these mechanisms, maybe to Sarah's point, like these mechanisms are going to be evolving. I think it's going to be quite dynamic, quite uncertain. And by the way, that uncertainty is going to be a problem as well, because there are projects today that would really make sense, but that are hindered by this investor uncertainty about 5 to 10 years from now and where the LCFS might land based on all of the hype that we're promoting here, you know. So
and that's it. I always find it's hard for policymakers to think of both emissions reductions policy and industrial development policy. You see it with the LCFS up here, Frank. You see it with the clean fuel standard, where there, I think, is some irrational exuberance around the degree to which the clean fuel standard will incent hydrogen production, but they're designing something that arguably will not be financeable by the people who actually want to build hydrogen infrastructure. So maybe in 30 seconds or less, is there another policy instrument that we should look at for hydrogen? Something like a carbon copy of the Section 45Q in the US for carbon capture. Could that apply to hydrogen?
Yeah, I mean, maybe a production tax credit kind of concept would make a lot of sense. I mean, let me be clear. Today in the United States, if there was an investment tax credit for an electrolyzer, the same as is available for a battery with a solar facility, green hydrogen would be in business with gas. Would outcompete gas genuinely in certain. Final point about California. The one thing that is bothersome about California's approach, I think, is that it is so specific. It's actually quite limiting. There are real opportunities around the continental North America to do some very interesting stuff that would benefit, that could kind of flow back into California, for example. But some of the specificity and the kind of geographical specificity in particular limits the applicability. I think they could be a little bit more open-minded in supporting that, and I think it would help the sector move ahead more rapidly.
Great. All right, Frank, we're giving you last word today. So I just want to thank you very much. Thanks to Dr. Frank O'Sullivan for sharing his time with us today. You can give us feedback at energyversusclimate@gmail.com. Remember, that is energyvsclimate@gmail.com. And we look forward to seeing you all again in 2 weeks' time. Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keefe, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Eva Wojniczewski. Mika McFarlane provides webinar support. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.substack.com. Interact with us live every other week and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen.